So 5-MeO-DMT, it has a reputation as the Mount Everest of psychedelics. And it's famous for the potency with which it can send users into profoundly altered states. But from a scientific perspective, studies about 5-MeO-DMT phenomenology are really only just starting to emerge. And so we know quite little about it from an empirical perspective. So how can researchers help to shed light on this Mount Everest of experiences? And to help set the tone, I'm going to go straight into a quote from one of the participants from Tandava. So they said, "In my everyday waking consciousness, there's a subject and object boundary, and a sense of kind of an interior realm or world or awareness that is distinct from what is outside of me and outside of my body. And that feeling, that sort of awareness simply just falls away, like it disappears, it dissolves, it collapses into this light, infinite and eternal, undifferentiated and perfect. It's everything and nothing, all at once, right now, forever." So Everest here represents this experience. It's a radical departure from the ordinary structures of consciousness. And the common approach in psychedelic research is to take something like this and compress it into something like this. So reducing dimensionality of phenomena is very important for empirical research, and simple questionnaire models are definitely important for answering certain types of research questions. But if we're studying consciousness itself, we have to acknowledge that there's certain limitations to these approaches. So one limitation is that psychedelic experience is characteristically dynamic. And psychedelic questionnaires typically ignore this and average the qualities out over the duration of a journey. Another limitation is that psychedelic experience is emergent and context dependent. But psychedelic questionnaires typically try to box experiences in with outdated and vague constructs like mystical experience. So in the DMT research group at Imperial College London's Centre for Psychedelic Research, we're especially interested in short-acting tryptamines like DMT and 5-MeO-DMT because they can produce profound effects on the content and structure of consciousness, but then return the participant back to baseline consciousness within a matter of minutes. And we study psychedelic consciousness in the hopes that it will help inform our understanding of consciousness more broadly, especially when it comes to how consciousness relates to the brain. And to achieve this, we use a paradigm known as micro-phenomenology. So micro-phenomenology, Francisco Varela was an early proponent of this, and he recognized that both the brain and lived experience are highly structured phenomena, and that these structures seem to mutually constrain each other. And so if we want to understand the mind and the brain, bringing together phenomenology and neuroscientific perspectives is going to be more enlightening than studying either one in isolation. But he also recognized that traditionally there's a degree of methodological rigor applied to the study of the brain that just wasn't there with the study of lived experience. And so micro-phenomenology was developed to address this issue. And in a micro-phenomenological interview, the interviewer guides the interviewee to give rich and systematic descriptions of a single lived experience. And the interviewer takes care to avoid confabulations, generalized descriptions, and post hoc explanations. And it stands out from other qualitative methods because of its strong temporal focus. So determining a clear and coherent timeline of the experience is an important objective for the micro-phenomenologists. So at the Center for Psychedelic Research, we specialize in this method of micro-phenomenology. And we've been using micro-phenomenology to study 5-MeO-DMT in both naturalistic settings and in the lab. And this is in studies spearheaded by Chris Timmerman and Malin Udhag as well. So before I talk about results from the Tandava study, I just want to share a little bit about this previous study on the screen here, because this is the phenomenological foundation that the work at Tandava built on. So this article here isn't out yet, but it will be very soon. So for this observational study, we visited retreats in Spain and the Netherlands, and people were served either synthetic 5-MeO-DMT or 5-MeO-DMT containing toad secretions. And the doses were chosen by the retreat facilitator. We measured EEG, and then after the experience performed micro-phenomenological interviews shortly after return to baseline. And these interviews were analyzed to show the qualities and also the trajectories of the participant experiences. And so from this analysis, we could identify a range of broad experiential categories, these stages that were present in the descriptions of the experience. And we brought them together into a kind of simplified phenomenological model. So each box that you see here is a particular type of experience. And the arrows show possible transitions between these experiences that participants followed as they flowed from start to finish of their experience. And to give you a picture of what these experiences were like, I'm going to describe them with some examples. So in the immersion and merging category, participants experienced a reduction of awareness in immediate surroundings accompanied by intense sensations or emotions moving through or being released from the body. And there was a sense of becoming the sensations or the emotions. So this participant said, I could feel energy centered in the torso, warm energy, very beautiful. The emotions are giving birth to energy within. I was feeling like I'm letting go of something. Didn't really exist as a person. My surroundings didn't exist. Like I was the emotions and the energy. Next, in the abstract category, participants had, well, the body, the narrative self, and the capacity for reflective thought, they were absent. And the experience could be described as non-spatial, but nonetheless, there was some elementary spatial form that could be described. So this participant said, there were no limits or no objects, no dimensions even. I had no thought, I had no senses. But I had some feeling of like a pyramid or something. And the color, it was kind of a rose color. But it's not that I saw this, it was more a feeling of the space. And then everything and nothing category. So this is a state in which very little can be described. And what is described is often done so in paradoxical terms. So time, space, sensory experience, thought, bodily self, even the subject-object dichotomy, it's all eradicated. And it's often described as a void that contains everything. So this participant said, I was not there. It was like accessing whiteness. Quiet, blissful, enormous whiteness. I was everything. There was no controller or observer. It was not me. I somehow had a glimpse of the wholeness. So you may have noticed that the paper was titled Exploring 5-MeO-DMT as a Pharmacological Model for Deconstructed Consciousness. But what are we talking about when we say deconstruction, and how does that specifically relate to these categories? So the idea is that a typical serotonergic psychedelic like DMT tends to increase the level of detail and content in subjective experience. But 5-MeO-DMT, based on the descriptions that we've been given, it seems to do the opposite, and people are left with less and less to describe. And so this is very interesting for cognitive neuroscience, because here we have a very minimal difference between these two molecules. It's really a tiny difference. And yet there's very different effects on the structure of conscious experience. And so to connect these phenomenological categories to cognitive neuroscience, we took some commonly studied constructs in consciousness research, and we assessed them across these different categories, these stages of the 5-MeO-DMT experience. And the constructs are the embodied self, so this is the lived experience of having or being a body. The narrative self, which is the kind of felt knowing of who am I, where am I, what am I. The capacity for thought and reflection. Sensory disconnection from the environment. And then the number of phenomenological distinctions. So we can think of this essentially as how rich with details a moment of experience is. And there's a lot to take in here, but I want to bring your attention to the fact that in the abstract and the everything and nothing categories, these constructs are all heavily diminished or completely absent. So this lends itself to this narrative of deconstructing or stripping back the usual structures of consciousness. But there's a couple of limitations on this model. So the first one is that 14 participants survived the EEG preprocessing, which means we had enough to build a basic model, but not enough to say that new categories wouldn't arise if we had more participants. And also, the analysis showed the sequence, which means we know when categories occurred in relation to each other. But it wasn't possible for participants to tell us precisely when these categories occurred in relation to clock time, in relation to minutes passed since the dose was received. So that's the foundation we were coming from when we came on board to do some micro-phenomenological work with the UCL and Tandava retreats collaboration. And this study was different from our previous observational work because the retreat center had been formally brought in as collaborators. And this means that the participants were recruited specifically for research, and the retreat team could make a more controlled environment. So participants were recruited based on experience and suitability for EEG. The dose was standardized. Facilitation was standardized as much as was safe and possible. And then we had a larger number of participants than we had had at previous sites. And under these conditions, we could implement some key innovations on our micro-phenomenological protocols. So these are mainly focused on making the results more temporally precise and rich. And we did this by taking really exhaustive time-stamped notes about every little thing that happened that the researchers could observe during the session. And this included not just participant behaviors, but also facilitator behaviors and even noises from outside. So in this place in Mexico, there's a lot of fireworks going off, there's bird noises, there's construction noises. We took notes on everything. And so we also then invited the participant into the analysis process by taking some time at the end of each interview to connect each moment of the experience they described to a timeline and asking them to rate their confidence in this timing. And this was done by comparing to those observer notes that we took. And the result was a highly detailed and temporally grounded account of each participant's experience. So this is an example of one person's experience, and this colored line represents the consecutive stages of the experience. And each stage in the line is labeled with an arbitrary name that's based on the participant's words. And the stages have been grounded in clock time below using the observational notes. So I'm going to talk you through this experience. So for this participant, for a brief moment at the beginning, she saw a grayish spiral emerge in front of her. She went through it feeling as if she was dissolving into everything around her. And when she was fully dissolved, she became a limitless, vast nothing. She had a feeling of ecstatic bliss and enormous energy, but no body to feel it with. And there's a pure felt sense of being every possible thing, but there's no specific things to perceive or pay attention to. And there's not even an I who is the perceiver. And this participant had a wonderful quote that I'd like to share with you. So it's like riding a nuclear weapon, but there is no rider, and there's nothing to be ridden. Okay, so from this limitless nothing, she started to come back online. And this limitless ecstatic bliss, it starts to contract and be compacted into the form of a human body. And it's experienced as an immense surge of energy. It's streaming down and towards her womb. And she notices at this point that she has physical signs of sexual arousal. And she describes the energy as like an orgasm, like the universe is making love to itself. Then there's a shift from feeling this energy to seeing it. It's flowing and dancing in front of her like streams. And that's followed by a period of being presented with important relationships in her life. And she's not seeing individual people, but she's instead feeling their essence, one after the other. And this was followed by a period of coming in and out of moments of equanimous peace, and also reflecting and thinking about her current circumstances there in the dosing room. So as for how this was grounded in clock time, together with the participant, we established that this limitless nothing phase lasted from very shortly after the dose was given until around minute 11 and a half. And the participant was able to state this with quite a high level of confidence because in our observational notes, there were 2 alarm sounds that went off, but she was only aware of the second one. And in fact, it was that second alarm sound that perturbed her into that next phase of coming online. And so the phases that followed that were short, but she knew that the final phase coincided with a sighing noise that she made later in the experience that was also in our notes. So with these highly detailed participant timelines, we could use these as a starting point to update the previous model based on these new experiences. And we found that most of the model was able to accommodate those new experiences. However, there were some changes. So immersion and merging, abstract, everything and nothing, these carried over well with their descriptions quite similar to what we saw at previous sites. But we were also able to identify a new category for periods of time where there's no reportable experience. And we still don't fully understand whether this is due to a loss of consciousness or a breakdown of memory or some combination of these phenomena. And we've also added a category for visionary experiences. So these are immersive, visual, or multi-sensory experiences with complex representations of people, places, objects. And it's sometimes experienced like a psychedelic dreamscape of imagery, or alternatively as living out a scene or a memory from a particular perspective. So some examples of the visionary experiences. One participant said, "I'm seeing different indigenous cultures." It had a rainbow quality, feathers, drums, swords. Some of these things would be coming around, as if I'm kind of looking on a movie screen, but all of it is part of me. I feel it moving through my bones and my body. Another participant said, "I saw a vision of me as a child on the trampoline. I was trying to do a front flip and hit my face. I felt my head hurting. I felt the disappointment. But I wasn't in my younger body. I was an observer, hanging out on the lawn, watching it happen." So this is interesting because here we actually have a mixture of deconstruction and construction in the 5-MeO-DMT experience. So then we can also use these very detailed timelines to temporally ground the categories from this model. And this graph shows the prevalence of selected categories at each minute during the experience for all participants. So this isn't just one participant now, this is the full sample. And we can see that all categories, including this highly deconstructed everything and nothing state, reached peak prevalence very rapidly within the first minute or two. And we also see that the prevalence of visionary states seems to peak a bit slower around the 5-minute mark, but we should be a bit careful interpreting this result because there was actually fairly few participants who had these visionary experiences. And it's interesting that, yeah, this largely maps on to the EEG results that George was showing us. It's a lot of those peak experiences are during the first 10 minutes. And so also for the first time, we see that these moments where there's no reportable experience under 5-MeO-DMT, they can occur very early on, just after the initial moments of the experience, again in the first minute or two. And this is when we can assume that there's peak levels of plasma concentration for 5-MeO-DMT. But this lack of reportability could also sometimes extend well up to a maximum range of 15 minutes here, so quite long. And then aside from, oh, sorry, I missed something I was going to say here. So yeah, this is a nice result. And it's good to see this empirically on a timeline, these states of deconstruction under 5-MeO. But I want to drive home that one of the most important parts of what we've done here is using the micro-phenomenological method to assign each participant with a category at each minute. And this means that our next step will be to validate this phenomenological model by assessing whether these categories have unique signatures in the EEG data at each of these time points. And this is called triangulation, and it's an important goal in neurophenomenology, helping to establish how experience relates to the brain under 5-MeO DMT. And then, yeah, there's also some phenomenological questions that emerge from this continued analysis. So, how do the qualities of onset affect the subsequent states of deconstruction? What kinds of experience are possible during immersion and merging? So this is about breaking some of those categories down into smaller categories. I think we could probably do this. Then we wonder, are no report states under 5-MeO DMT more like memory loss? Or are they more like advanced meditation states where awareness itself is deconstructed? And are there different subtle flavors of subject-object deconstruction that occurred but were not precisely noticed or described in this sample? And so these last 2 points, they highlight the importance of comparing the 5-MeO DMT experience to advanced meditation states and doing this work using a sample of advanced meditation practitioners. And this is because throughout Buddhism, there's many rich accounts of non-dual and contentless states. And so if we have advanced practitioners, advanced meditation practitioners as study participants, we might be able to use the clarity and the sensitivity with which they approach these states to identify any etiology-specific characteristics of deconstruction under 5-MeO DMT or meditation. And we recently hosted a Buddhist Lama in the lab for some of this kind of work, and I can't share anything now, but we're excited to share those results in future. So just to summarize some of what I presented here, I showed that deconstruction of common cognitive structures is a valid lens for researchers to use when looking at the effects of 5-MeO DMT. And I showed an advanced method to richly measure and model psychedelic experiences in naturalistic settings for micro-phenomenological research. And that led to a dynamic and temporally grounded, micro-phenomenologically informed model of 5-MeO DMT experience that we can use in neurophenomenological analysis. And then we just finished up with those suggestions for phenomenological refinement. But another interesting outcome of this research process is that over the course of these studies, there's been overwhelming feedback that the interview process has been helpful and very impactful for participants' integration process. And for this reason, we're expanding this method of phenomenological interviewing to become part of the integration specialists toolkit. And we're starting this at Imperial College with 2 upcoming trials. So we're looking at opiate use disorder and gambling disorders and treating those with psilocybin. So I'm going to train all of the therapists in this style of phenomenological interviewing as part of that therapy package. And then starting next month, I'm going to offer a course for any integration specialists who are interested in learning. So you can visit my website. It's integratingexperience.com. I just want to finish by saying, just acknowledging the role of our participants, who are absolutely amazing. These people, they climbed Everest for this research, so I give them a special shout out. And that's it. Thank you.